Welcome back, everyone. You are listening to Intersect, which is a podcast dedicated to the celebration of the convergence of God, the world, and the church. I am your host, and my name is Matt Skolnick. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I am also the executive director of about 70 Reformed congregations or Presbyterian congregations in Eastern Ohio. Today, I have a topic that I want to share with you that I have been wrestling with some of our churches for about a year now. And over this time, we've been able to clarify our thoughts and clarify our language around it. We think that it's something that is very important. Right now, we're trying to multiply a model that we have developed. And when I say multiply a model, it's not just within our local Presbyterian churches, because as we come to new iterations, we're finding out that people from other backgrounds and other traditions are recognizing that there is some validity to our leadership model. The current mode of thinking that we have is that leadership is a stool, a three-legged stool, and that if you have only two legs or only one leg, it's really hard to sit on that stool and to find some stability. So we have defined over a period of conversations that each leg represents a form of leadership that we believe are essential to the life of any local church in this time and in this place. I'll just name those forms of leadership at the beginning, and then after I name them, what I can do is I can go into a little bit more detail about why we need them, how we've fallen short in these particular forms of leadership, and why they work particularly well together. So the first form of leadership that we believe is absolutely essential to all churches right now is good, strong, organizational leadership. We're not talking about just people who dot the I's and cross the T's, but people who have the ability to move the church forward. I'll give that some depth in a few moments. The second form of leadership that many churches have been missing is strong pastoral leadership. You may have in your mind what a pastor does or should do. We're going to help to try to clarify and strengthen those thoughts. And at the same time, I recognize that this might be a little bit of a sensitive topic because as pastors, we don't like to wrestle with the idea that perhaps we haven't been trained or perhaps we haven't been given the tools or the expectation that we need of pastoral leadership that is from the scriptures. And then the third form, or the third leg in the leadership stool, which is absolutely essential so that we don't fall over, so that we can balance, so that we have a strong foundation, is local mission leadership. Mission in such a way that focuses both on human need and on spiritual need. So let's circle back and talk briefly about organizational leadership. For me, there are two key forms of organizational leadership that we need to highlight, that we need to train, and that we need to expect from organizational leaders. Number one, organizational leaders or strong organizational leaders have the ability to work with any given congregation and really just hold up a mirror and say, is this healthy or is this unhealthy? Is this something that is advancing the work of the church? Or is this something that just keeps us in an endless cycle of getting things done, but actually not accomplishing our mission? So let me just give you a few examples of this. I'm going to mention some examples that I have experienced. I'm not pointing out people in a way that I'm just trying to diminish them. What I want you to understand is that these are just representative examples, and the vast majority of churches that I see and that I work with, whether they are from the Presbyterian tradition or whether they are coming from a different background, have the same shortcomings. So when I first started this particular ministry, I did get a phone call from a gentleman who is a pastor, and he's told me a few things. One, we have no endowment. Two, we have no savings. And three, we have very little money in our checking account. Well, that seems to be a problem, and we can ask all sorts of questions around there. And then as I started to ask questions, I started to realize that there were some underlying issues, and I'll just give you one issue that highlights how churches can be blind to their current reality. So this particular congregation at the time worshiped, I think, around 30 people, maybe 40 people. They had a full-time pastor, which is a stretch for a congregation at that size. And then as I worked with them, I realized they also had a full-time administrative assistant. Now, if it was a stretch to have a full-time pastor, it is also a stretch to have a full-time administrative assistant for a church this size. But when churches are so close to the issue and when relationships are all intertwined, it's really hard to say, you know what, this isn't the best choice for us. This really isn't the best choice at this moment, at this time. And so I try to help them go through that. And of course, as congregations, we all have our blind spots, and good organizational leaders sometimes need to come from the outside to be able to hold up that mirror, to hold up the reality and really just say, is this really the best that we can do? Let me give you a few other examples of where we see organizational leadership not at its peak. We have some churches, some are large, some are small, some are very tiny. I visited a church recently. In fact, I visit them a few times a year, and they typically worship about 15 people. They can't afford a full-time pastor. They're happy with pulpit supply. On my most recent visit, there were about 6 people there, and that had to do with a couple people being ill, a couple people traveling, and some other activities that were going on in the community. If I was a betting person, I would say that it would be unlikely, due to the age of the congregation, that this congregation is long for the world. And yet, that particular congregation was very proud, very thankful that they were able to write a $100,000 check to restore the stained glass windows in their sanctuary, where there are fewer and fewer people who were able to be there, and in a sanctuary that probably will not have a congregation in the next 5 to 10 years. These are examples of poor organizational leadership. And again, I could go on and on. I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I understand how these things happen. I understand that we try to do the best we can in any given moment. But the truth of the matter is whether we are talking about a large congregation or a tiny congregation or any congregation in between, that every church deserves strong organizational leadership. Towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about some methods that we can find, that we can offer to congregations, whether they are Presbyterian or not, to start to address and to bring in the leadership that congregations need. So that's the first one. The second one is the pastoral leadership. And the truth is that few of our congregations have full-time pastoral leadership. And that's okay. That's not okay. There's all sorts of ways to think about that. But my primary concern is that the pastoral leadership that they have learns to function in a different way. And again, this goes back to expectations, and this goes back to training. So just bear with me for a moment. I think it is very common in churches where the pastor has historically done most official ministry. It's the pastor who preaches. It's the pastor who prays. It is the pastor who gives comfort. It is the pastor who leads the Bible studies. All these sorts of things. The problem with this is that this model is neither biblical nor does it help the church grow and advance its mission. So let's talk about the biblical side first, and then we can talk about the shortcoming in terms of not being able to reproduce. So there is a passage in Ephesians chapter 4 where the Apostle Paul writes about pastors and prophets and evangelists. And he says that God gives these offices to the church for one specific reason. And the translation that I love the most is, it says, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. That is really powerful. Now, put that into context of most of our experience in churches. It is not uncommon to go to a church and find out that previous pastors in different generations refused to allow people to teach Bible study because they, as the pastor, were the authority. They were the trained ones. They were the ones who had all the theological and the biblical knowledge. And so people expected and learned only to receive and not to teach. The same thing could be said about prayer. Who typically has prayed in churches? Well, typically it is the pastor. Well, if we use this equipping model, I firmly believe that the definition of a pastor, as opposed to a chaplain, a pastor is somebody who equips the saints to do all the things the pastor does. So pastors, when was the last time that you taught people how to read the scriptures? When was the last time you taught people how to pray? When was the last time you taught people to lead the full worship service with or without you? When was the last time you taught the people to minister in the community and to build relationships and to welcome people into faith? My argument is that if we are not doing these things, we're actually not pastoring. We're performing the function of a chaplain. And there is a time and there is a place for a chaplain, and that ministry is very beautiful. But the chaplaincy model does not advance the work of the church. The chaplaincy model takes care of the acute need in the moment. We are in a position that the gospel calls us forth to much more. And so if we want to grow, if we want to survive, if we want to thrive, we have to multiply leadership. And that is the job of the pastor, to equip, to equip, to equip. Okay, and then there's a third leg in that leadership stool. That third leg is local mission engagement, local mission work. Now, as Presbyterians in the Reformed tradition, we tend to be fairly good at meeting human need. We tend to be fairly good at feeding people and clothing them and providing services that people in our community truly need and want. We might call these Matthew 25 ministries. In Matthew 25, Jesus has a parable about the sheep and the goats, and the king separates the righteous from the unrighteous. And the distinction there is those who feed the poor and those who don't, those who visit the prisoner and those who don't, those who care for the widow and those who don't, and the list goes on. And of course, there's that haunting verse where Jesus asks the question and makes the statement, actually, you never knew me. You never knew me when you didn't feed me. You never knew me when you didn't clothe me, and so forth. If we're going to take a full biblical view, we have the Matthew 25 type of mission, but we also have the Matthew 28 type of mission, or we often call it the Great Commission, where Jesus calls and commands the disciples to go into all of the world, to baptize, to raise disciples, to train them in the faith. Now, I think historically, as a church, sometimes we have vacillated or been good at one or the other. But I think the truth of the matter is that both are in the scriptures. And that if we are going to take the scriptures seriously, what we need to do is we need to be able to marry the Matthew chapter 25 and the Matthew 28 mission. One informs the other inspires the first. This is just how it works. They go hand in hand. To use the old analogy, it's like peanut butter and jelly, or my analogy, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. They have to go together. You can't have one without the other. So let me talk about how this plays out in the life of many Presbyterian churches and how we could make it better. First, I want to highlight one of our congregations who does a wonderful job of meeting the needs of the local congregation. I'm speaking of Central Presbyterian Church in Massillon, Ohio. We have other congregations who do wonderful things. I'm just pointing them out in celebrating their great work, but at the same time, I want to recognize, and this goes back to equipping, and this goes back to expectations and training. Our churches have not been taught, our churches have not had an expectation that there is more than that first meeting. So some years ago, there was a pastor at Central Presbyterian Church, a dear man. His name is Larry Lalama. Larry, when I was a young pastor, he was the type of guy that I would go to and I would cry. And I would just say, Larry, ministry's hard. And Larry, in his most gentle way, would take care of me and encourage me and get me back out onto the field so that I could pastor to the best I could at that particular time. Larry has done some other amazing things. One of the things that he did before he was retired was something that was called the door ministry, which is he would open up the door of the church to his city and he would have these one-on-one counseling relationships with people. Now, I did not witness this, but my vision of how Larry would do this was perhaps maybe a young man would come into the church, need some food, need some money, need some gas, all those types of things. He would tell Larry his story. Perhaps the story is, I have 6 kids and 3 different women have mothered them, and my life is a mess. And I can see Larry in all of his gentleness and all of his love, but also in all of his sturdiness, say something along the lines like, son, you need a job. And I don't care if it's not the job that you don't want to have. You're going to go down the street and you're going to get a job. And I just see that person go, yes, sir, I can do that, with Larry's love. So this is the type of thing that Larry did, and he did it countless times. In their church office, they have thousands of names, email addresses, phone numbers, driver's license of all the people that they have ministered to over the years. And there were some follow-up ministries, and I do want to celebrate all of this. But the point is that the larger system within the Presbyterian Church, and I think this is true whether you're Presbyterian or Methodist or whether you're Baptist or Catholic, there was never much of an expectation that more would be provided. These particular ministries are ministries that I would call first hellos. They are to the masses. And so Pastor Larry, Reverend Lalama did a phenomenal job reaching those masses. The question is, how do we provide stepping stones so that people can slowly walk across the creek from one side where their life is to where their life could be in a vital relationship with the Christian community where they're nurtured and loved and taught and they find their place to serve and where they can fall in love with God. And so we're good at this first hello piece, but there are some other pieces that are needed. There is a follow-up ministry to any mass group of people that is focused on a subset. And in fact, I want to take a moment to celebrate a few other things. The interim pastor who came after Larry did a really good job of getting the church involved in this door ministry. And now the current pastor, her name is Reverend Dr. Julie Ann Joy. She's there and she's thinking through and trying to figure out how to take the next step. A week or two ago when I had coffee with Jules, or Reverend Dr. Julie Ann Joy, I asked her, what is the need that you see in all of the masses of people that you come across? And for her, she didn't hesitate. And it is actually something that I understand, but I wasn't expecting at the same time. She said, time and time again, what we are seeing is an increased number of grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. And here I was like, oh my, wow. Yeah, that's right. I see that. But the idea is that whether it's the grandparents raising grandchildren or not, there is a subset who has a specific need, a need that is larger than just that door ministry need. And so then the question becomes is what is the next level of service that the church can provide for these people so that we can continue to build relationships, so we continue to encourage them, so we can continue to walk in some type of faithful, faith-filled relationship with them. And of course, there's all sorts of answers there. I'm not going to know them all, but I know that legal issues are one. I know managing relationships between the generations, the whole system, but then with individual generations, there's all sorts of needs there that could be followed up with. And so that would be a second stepping stone across the creek. And then I think there's also a third one, and this is what we are so excited about, is that when we have a conversation with the masses, and then when we start to serve different subsets, do we have the ability to welcome some people from those subsets into a vibrant faith community? Whether we are helping them to develop their own faith community, whether we are helping them find another local church, or whether we are welcoming them into our local congregation, the point is that we're not just there doing the Matthew 25 stuff, we're doing the Matthew 28 stuff as well. And again, it's that peanut butter and the chocolate. Again, I'm going to say chocolate, not jelly, because who doesn't love chocolate, right? Okay, so this is a form of leadership that our churches need, and it is empty. Some of our churches can reach the masses. Some of our churches can be taught to reach the masses. But some of our churches just do some token ministries in the world. In any case, we have room to improvement. We have room to grow. We have a call to more fully live into the gospel and to see all the ways that God can change hearts and lives and communities. So I've mentioned three forms of leadership on this leadership stool that have come through our conversations. There's the organizational leader who helps us stop stupid things. We have the organizational leader who helps focus in on the mission of the church to actually accomplish something. We also have that pastoral leader who helps equip. And then we have the local mission leader who has the ability to slowly walk churches into relationships with their community in a way that focuses on the physical and on the spiritual need as well. As I was speaking through that, I did realize that there's another point in the organizational leadership that I forgot that I think would be helpful. That point is this. Not only do the organizational leaders help us avoid some of those stupid mistakes that we make from time and time again, and I say that with gentleness and with grace, knowing that we all were blind sometimes. But those organizational leaders have the ability to align the work of the church to accomplish its mission, to accomplish the Matthew 28 and the Matthew 25, the Matthew 25 and the Matthew 28. And I just want to give you an example of the different levels of conversations that church boards or church committees can have. So I think it's common that a lot of churches have in the past, or maybe even still today, have done a ministry that's called Vacation Bible School. I grew up in Vacation Bible School. I've loved Vacation Bible School. And so those conversations in the committee or the board level typically go like this. When are we going to have Vacation Bible School? What is the curriculum that we're going to use, and who's going to volunteer, and what kind of resources do we need? Those are all management questions. They are important questions. They're not questions that need to be forgotten. But I think the board, especially, whether it's the elders or the session or however you term it, their level of conversation has to be higher. There are better questions that can be asked. So instead of asking, how do we do Vacation Bible School, perhaps we ask questions like, how do we encourage families in the faith in our community? How do we reach the kids in our community? It's just a different way of thinking. And again, we have been trained in this old system where lots of people came to church, so we didn't have to ask these questions. It is high time that we ask these types of questions. Okay, sorry to go back on that one. That one is important. So we have these three legs, these three needs of leadership within our churches. And the older I get, the more I realize everything in the life of the church, or really in any organization, hinders on good, strong, vibrant leadership. It is one of my passions to find a way to get this type of robust leadership into the life of any local church. So how can we do that? One way that we can do that is through something that is called a partnership. And this is where we learned we learned to name these leadership legs last year. We have one partnership that's been up and running for 4 months. We actually have 3 more in the pipeline. They're early in the conversations, and prayerfully they will be able to come together. But here's the idea. A small congregation cannot afford all of this leadership. So how do you increase the pie? How do you increase the chunk of people and the resources so that you can afford some of this leadership? And really the best way to do that is to put some churches together. And you can put them together in a way that they maintain their unique identity, where you're not merging them, but where they can share this gift-based leadership. The first partnership that we put together has a half-time organizational leader who is also an ordained pastor, a full-time equipping pastor, and a part-time couple who work on the local mission and outreach piece. To see the energy that this team of 4 can provide to 3 churches has been such a blessing. It is not perfect. It is not easy. There's all sorts of bumps in the road, but they are on the journey, and we are so thankful that they are there. As a little side note, at least in our system, we have something that's called minimum terms of call, or effective salary, what you would pay a pastor, which would include the salary and housing and retirement and benefits and whatnot. The minimum is a pretty sizable amount of money. The point that I'm trying to make is when we were able to put this partnership together, we were able to do it then for $15,000 less than when we did before. And now that some costs have gone up, that partnership, if you were just going to have one pastor do everything, that partnership is saving those churches about $20,000 a year, which is amazing to me, because then you can reinvest that money back into mission and outreach and care for the community. So a partnership is one way to do that. If you have any desire, whether you are local or across the country or across the world, to talk about partnership, please reach out to me. I would love to talk to you about this. I think this is a phenomenal idea that our people have been able to come up with. And we just have this conversation that I'm having right now over and over and over again. It takes about 6 months to get enough people on board to understand it, where they would first, think about it, and then they would ask a question and sharpen it and make it a little bit better, and then they would embrace it, and then they would really buy into it. So there is this process, and I'd be happy to talk to you about how to put that process together, or walk with you to put that process together. And the truth of the matter is, speaking of equipping, we are trying to find other people who have walked this journey, who have the ability to lead these conversations. And actually, I'm very excited. We have a pastor in training who is in on the second round, who's starting to come to some conversations. And I actually think she will have the ability in the long run to lead some of these conversations. So we're very thankful for that. Again, we're trying to multiply leadership. There are other ways that we can provide this leadership outside of partnerships. The next way that we can provide this leadership outside of partnerships is by kind of a piecemeal approach. So let me just give you an example of how that can be done. There are great and strong organizational leaders in any community. And at the same time, I bet you'd be able to find some who have deep faith, who are Christians. Now, the beauty of all of this is that often strong organizational leaders, when they reach the apex of their career, they retire, and then they still have all these skills, but they have time, and they tend not to need a whole lot of money. So I have been building relationships with local leaders, whether they are Presbyterian or not, and trying to find a way to get them into relationships with churches where either they can volunteer or where they can be employed at a very minimal level just to walk that administrative or that organizational leadership road with pastors and with church leaders. So we're very thankful for that. Again, there's an invitation. If you know somebody in your community and you would like help putting those relationships together, I would be very excited to do that with you. The pastoral leadership piece, I do believe needs to be trained locally. So we can send people away to get some theological education, but I think we really need to train pastors to be equippers locally, because the seminaries just are not equipped to do that. They are equipped to give us thinkers. They're equipped to give us people who can exegete the scriptures, who can preach, and those types of things. And those are essential tasks, but there's much more to being a pastor that's centered around the equipping piece. And again, I think locally we can do that. We come from the Presbyterian tradition, and in the Presbyterian tradition, John Calvin, who was in the middle of the Reformation, didn't have what we would call Reformed seminaries or Presbyterian seminaries. So the question that they had to wrestle with was, how do we train pastors? And they didn't do it with seminaries. They did it with something that was called the Company of Pastors. And they did this for theological training, but I think you can do it for other types of training as well. And so I would love to come and talk to your area or a group of churches about the Company of Pastors, and that being a model where we can train, raise up, and equip local leaders. And then finally, and this is one that I'm very excited about, our particular organization, our presbytery, has invested in a woman who has a heart and a passion for ministry. Her name is Terry Bate. Terry has raised money for mission locally and abroad. She's run chapters of Habitat for Humanity and worked in other organizations. But Terry has been charged with raising money so that we can hire, and this, I think, is really a beautiful idea. We can call and train and hire and equip local, indigenous, what we would call mission partners, some people would call missionaries, to walk alongside of our churches so that our churches have that mission leadership piece. And actually, the more we get into this, the more I realize that I think we need to be expanding that piece, asking bigger questions, asking God-sized commitments. And I think there's a lot of energy around this where we will get not just the small gifts and the medium gifts, but also the large gifts, so that churches, whether they are Presbyterian or not, have the ability to make a major impact in the life of their community, an impact that transforms lives, that transforms spiritual lives, that transforms the community as a whole. And so that is another method. We have the partnership method, but we also have the piecemeal method as well. Okay, that is a lot that I just shared. You may or may not notice that I had 0 notes for this, and that's because I've led this conversation time and time again. It's something that I believe in. It's something that I'm passionate about, and I would love to come and engage with your local congregation around these issues. Again, I want to make it clear that this is not limited to the Presbyterians. We're not trying to steal churches. We're just trying to figure out how we can get the leadership into our churches that are needed. And I'll just give you a little segue. In one of the partnerships that is in an early stage of forming, there are 7 or 8 churches in that conversation, and a handful are Presbyterian, but the other churches come from a variety of denominations and non-denominations. And I do think that there is a way to kind of put together some of this leadership so that we can bless not just the Presbyterian churches, but we can bless other churches who are around us as well. I understand that needs to be done carefully and respectfully. I understand that will require some conversations with some people at the local church and perhaps higher up in their organizational structure, but I do believe that it can be done. Okay, why don't you bow your head with me, and we'll close in prayer as we ask God to transform our lives and our churches and be made more aware of God's kingdom here and now. Let's pray. Oh, merciful and gracious God, we thank you so much for your love. We thank you so much for your peace. We thank you that you do not leave us abandoned. We thank you that you walk with us, that you call us each by name. We thank you that you give the church everything that is needed, all the resources that are needed. We thank you that we don't have to live in a spirit of scarcity, but we worship the God of the universe. And we know that all things are at your disposal. And so, Lord, as we offer our hearts, as we offer our minds, as we offer our lives to you, we ask that you would allow us to see you anew. We ask that you would refresh us with your Spirit. But above all, Lord, we ask that our mission would be a mission that is faithful to your gospel and to the kingdom. We ask that we would be people of healing and wholeness and salvation. We ask that as we explore, as we wrestle, as we try to figure out ministry in this day and age, that you would redefine us in a way that reminds us that church is not a building, it's not an institution, it's not a show, it's not an organization, but it is a collection of people who worship and honor you, who try to follow Jesus, the teachings and the methodology. Warm our hearts, warm our minds, and bring healing where we need it. In the name of Jesus Christ, we give thanks. Amen.